ladies and gentlemen, I think the discussion of particularly, Frank gave us this great overview, but I want to emphasize the role of community colleges. I had the privilege of teaching at two in Southern California, Pasadena City College and Santa Monica College. And the students range like your students range, all over. And I taught U.S. history at 7 o'clock in the morning, okay? And I remember when the dean called and said, "You'll be teaching at 7 o'clock in the morning." And I said, "Well, who will I be teaching? Who's going to show up for this 7 o'clock in the morning class?" And he said, "Oh, it'll be full. It'll be full." And it was. It was totally full. And, not everybody was awake, but everybody was there. And it was an extraordinary thing. And so since I had to drive about an hour to get to this thing, I arrived fully caffeinated and awake, and the student evaluations came back, and they said something along the lines, just way too much energy for 7 in the morning. So one of the things that wasn't quite addressed, and I don't know what the current statistic is because my information is about 10 years old. About 10 years ago, we convened a conference at Columbia Teachers College to talk about integrating the teaching about China and East Asia in the teacher preparation. And that fell completely apart. But one of the things at that time that I brought to the conference was that about a third of California's teachers were being prepared by for-profit colleges. And that was a shocking statistic to me. The major research institutions really don't do any of this. I mean, on the scale, it isn't happening. UCLA, USC, Berkeley, none of them produce that many teachers. It's coming out of the CSU system. It's coming out of some of these for-profit schools. I'm not sure about the current statistics. And I want to say that for those of you who are advising students, students who are promising, and you have many of them, sending them to community college makes perfect sense. The two schools that I know best, UCLA and USC, that is a very good route to those schools, and you save a ton of money doing it. And so, and seriously, you get a quality education. Smaller classes, really talented instructors, it's an extraordinary opportunity. So I just wanted to endorse that. And of course, the community colleges also have this vocational education role that we haven't really stressed. But that, of course, is a big issue in China, also in Taiwan. And one of the striking things is in Taiwan, vocational education is booming. And they charge the same tuition as to go to the major universities in Taiwan. So it's not a bargain deal, but they're turning students away. And I asked why. You know what the answer was. Our students get jobs. Our students are infinitely employable. So this is really terrific. And now we've got time for your questions for Lenora and Frank. And we have a question here. Get our next questioner on deck.
Yeah, right here.
Please.
When I was in China about 4 years ago with a group of teachers, we toured some of the schools. And one of the things they mentioned was the fact, this happened to be middle school, that the classroom size was much larger, like 50, 60 students. But in addition to that, they had a teacher, but they also had an adult who was totally in charge of discipline. Big difference than American schools. Mm-hmm. Do they still do that? And could we learn from that approach?
It's on.
Okay. Yes, in kindergarten, primary school, you will see teacher's aides. In kindergarten, primary schools, there's a master teacher, an associate teacher, and in the earlier years, there's even an IE. So you have 3 adults for maybe anywhere from 30 to 60 kids, and that's, there's more adults there. And discipline is incredibly important. They believe in instilling it very, very early, and that children can learn to sit from a very young age, from even the age of 3. It's all about impulse control. So they think that discipline is the first step to educating a child, and they will do everything in their power to do that.
Yeah, one of the watchwords that we got out of Little Soldiers, churku, that just apply yourself. And you can't apply yourself if you're not there, if you're not present, if you're not applied, right? I think Ken had a question. There's a question here also. Please.
Maybe I can ask two, but these are both kind of like idealistic. The first is I was a teacher for a long time, and I am not a morning person, and I will say that that is a big part of the reason why I stopped after 18 years. And I'm curious if anyone in China is also, like, the U.S. seems to have no interest in addressing the sleep deficit issue with students, and I'm just curious if China has done anything in that regard. That's my first one. And then the second totally idealistic question is anyone in Chinese education or American education asking, because of developments in machine learning and automation, asking how do you educate people for what might potentially be an extremely short work week? Like in a perfect world, rather than people just acting as brute force, I think it's different to educate somebody to be to get a job and to live a life where they have to figure out what it means to be a productive human if they are not occupied all their time by just trying to eat. And so I'm curious about both of those.
Both of our speakers will be able to talk to that.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I quite understand your second part of your question about having all that leisure time, but we have,
Having never met it.
you know, in Sonoma County lifestyle, you know, we have wineries, we have breweries, and we have cannabis. So people find a way to cope with the stress. But we are starting a brewery program, a distillery. We're also doing a drone operating program. So we're trying to develop, of course, the vocational piece that we see the future workforce is going to take. And as you know, in the more, like my daughter works, was working at a startup, and she's working 60 hours a week, and she got burnt out. You know, so that wasn't the quality of life that she wanted. So I don't know if we're cognizantly thinking about that. We're still on that thing about not so much how hard you work, but where the career is going to be. And now we have a bond measure where we're building new campuses. We're putting in maker spaces. We're trying to create what the future work environment will look like. That's the best I can do to answer the question.
Yeah, one of the things about the community colleges is it's great for the back to school, career number 2 step.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, as kids approach those testing milestones, like the high school and college entrance exam, they're doing study from 8 a.m. all the way till midnight. Really, they don't get much sleep. And you'll see policy documents, Chinese policy documents that reference sleep deficits and bodies wasted away by study, even failing eyesight. They measure eyesight, and some people think there's a link to how much kids are bent over books. So they definitely are looking at that, and that's part of all those reform measures. As far as automation, in China, in the manufacturing sector, it's a 6-day work week. Yeah. I see more people completely unemployed rather than more people employed half-time. I think at least in China, that's sort of where it's headed.
Yeah, I think the service industries, there may be some underemployment, but in manufacturing, the problem is the double shifts and things like that. Please, Ken.
So, hi, thank you for being here. 3 days ago, I'm sure you saw this, the Pew Center came out with a survey that showed, I'm just reading it off my screen, 36% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say the nation's institutions of higher learning are having a positive effect, meaning that 64% think that that our higher learning institutions are having a poor effect, a detrimental effect on our country. I'm interested in your perspectives of that. Did you know about the study?
That's the first I've heard of it. It doesn't surprise me because all the indicators from the current administration is very anti-intellectualism, anti-education, and so.
I don't mean to be rude, but but I do want to be fair. And on the Democratic end, it was 72% of Democrats feel they are who think that higher institutions are good for our economy and country. I just want to be fair.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a partisan issue. I mean, it's a matter of like, what is the purpose of higher education? Is it to get a job? Is it to become a complete human being, to develop your citizenship? So it really varies. As a community college president, I have both come into my school. So I think value and benefit really depends on who you ask and what people get out of it, right? And so we have students who come in and they fail miserably, and what are the reasons? They're multiple, right? So it's really hard to make general statements based on a poll that was done about positive versus negative. It's like, what was your experience, and what are the statistics show that I tried to show in terms of trend lines? So my reaction is that every day educators in America have to defend and have to really go out and fight for the value that education brings to the country. And as one person said to me, if you think college is expensive, try being out of college. What type of earning power do you have from an economic standpoint? What type of complete individual will you be to help deal with the social problems this country faces today and tomorrow going forward?
Yep.
No.
Comparatively, how do you think that from a Chinese perspective, what the view of higher education would be?
That is the goal. College and university and a normal academic university, not the vocational track or anything else, is the goal of pretty much every Chinese school child. And it's unfortunate because not everybody can go down that track. So there needs to be re-education in the culture that, frankly, migrant workers and people going through some of these vocational tracks actually are making more money than a top-tier university graduate in China. All the numbers show that. They're making less money, these university graduates. But unfortunately, parents still want that. They want that degree. So we need to have the sort of shift in thinking in China.
Yeah, the key thing that's come out of a couple of the presentations is the notion that a college degree provides a certain future, right, as opposed to the uncertainty of the marketplace. And one of the things that these surveys sometimes hide is if you ask about the school down the street or the school your children attend, those are always ranked higher than American education. So that phenomena in the polling, I think, plays out as well. Please.
Thank you. So I have two questions, one for Dr. Chong and the other one for Ms. Chu. Actually, one based on what you said about the merit of the community colleges that we have. Actually, the Chinese are very much understanding that game now. In fact, many Chinese students are graduating from high school. They have less of a chance getting into the top universities in America, so they go the route of going into community colleges and then perhaps do the 2 years, become the top students, and then apply to UCL and then colleges like that. But the question I have for Dr. Chong is like, from outside, we certainly see that as an economic incentive to have these Chinese students coming in because they can pay. What are we doing to actually to support them? I think oftentimes in the last 5 and 10 years, there are many schools taking Chinese students but do not really have a comprehensive program to really making sure that they make the nice transition into our system and also the way. Do you guys have a good model that you guys are using, or do you know of a particular model that's being used by different schools, perhaps community colleges level, that really are serving the needs of these overseas students? I'm going to get to my second question right now for Ms. Chu, again, a little bit long, and has to do with, I think you were talking about how the parents are not in the game, the Chinese parents. Perhaps has to do with the fact that the belief in educators know best, and also for many years, many Chinese students actually going to boarding school. The parents just send them to schools on Sunday night, and they don't get them back until the weekend. So they really just relying on the schools to raise their children. Oftentimes, that many Chinese teachers I talk to, they have problems with being asked to not just keeping up the scores of the kids, but also being asked to raise the kids for the families. To what extent the Chinese educational system is educating the parents to be partner. Again, I want to see the parent education part
And you folks, of course, have no experience with parents saying, solve these problems. Please.
You want to go for it? All right. The answer to your question is yes, we are very cognizant of the cultural transition. And I've seen community colleges and other four-year schools who are, again, not providing the adequate student support services. So our students, we don't bring them here and ghettoize them and all the international students hang out together. We make a conscious effort to get them integrated into a life of the community. We set up service opportunities for them in the community to go to Rotaries, to go to volunteer at different places. So they get the whole American experience. And the trauma for a lot of students, not just from China, but just an 18 or 19-year-old coming from any place within the 5 continents is very, very important for us to transition well. And it's just like students in your classrooms. Some are good to go and they need very little support, and others are deadly homesick, and many will sometimes go home. So it's really hard for us to screen them because we're an open access institution. They show up at our doors and we tell them, this is what it's going to take for you to succeed here. And this is where we'll help you, but you have to help us as well. So that's a short answer to your question.
In Shanghai, the education sector is one of the fastest growing sectors, and one business that I see growing is this preparation for students in China to go abroad. And one of the things is the cultural training. Make sure you raise your hand, make sure you ask the professor questions, things like this. You cannot do homework together and turn in the exact assignment. I'm not joking, there's a class on this, right? So they're working, I'd say, Dr. Chong is working on it from this end. In China, there are a lot of, there's a lot of prep happening on that end too. But these are very, in general, the students that you see here straight from China, they're upper middle class, they're very elite, even, in all sectors. When you talk about boarding schools, that's the uber elite. I mean, we're talking about very, very wealthy families for the most part from top tier cities in China. I think that sector, the more money you have, there's an inverse correlation to how much you think, that you're beholden to the teacher. So that teacher respect is eroding as China's economy is changing and people have money. And the more they pay for an education, the more they think the teacher has to answer to them. Unfortunately, we're seeing that.
Yeah, the question about preparation, orientation, the issues of acculturation, dealing with the American environment are difficult ones. And maybe we can talk more about that. And the role of parents in K through 12 education on the two sides. We have a question here. We've got one here. We've got more. They continue. Please.
Hi, my question is also about parents. From my conversations with a lot of parents from China and friends from China, they are saying that parents would bribe their teachers so they would do favors for their students. And I was wondering how common this practice or this problem is.
It's
and
in the book.
What do people do anything about it? Thank you.
Yes, chapter 9. I try to not label it corruption because it really is a different way of. It's a cultural thing. There's a cultural expectation that you'll give a gift to people who are important in your life, and you can see how Teachers' Day, September 10th, everybody's lining up with gifts and Louis Vuitton. I mean, the pressure, the competitive pressure to make that a really, really nice gift is intense, and I talk about that in the book. I don't want to label it corruption, although many people like to do so, but the government is realizing this is contributing to inequality. Clearly, the families who can pay, in my kids' classroom, even seats are assigned on criteria other than height. I mean, on criteria based on things other than they should be, and you wonder, what is that criteria? Clearly, it's something else, and a lot of times it's gifting and money. And that practice is changing. Unfortunately, the Chinese who come over here, that's another cultural thing that they need to be trained on. So.
Yeah, my closest experience was when I was in high school in our AP math class, we sat according to our test scores. Wow. I already have bad eyes. They needed binoculars.
Yeah.
Please, here. Yes.
I guess I'm going to piggyback on the last two questions. I'm not speaking for anybody else here, but my student demographic, majority of them are either ABC or immigrants, and their parents are all immigrants, most of them. How do you recommend us as educators deal with the demand or even expectation or demand for uniformity, individual learning versus collaborative learning environments, adherences to like discipline codes, and the school having a strict discipline code versus having one that is more restorative, focus minded? How do we as educators deal with those type of differences?
Well, I think it's hard to change something that you've been ingrained with for so many years, and I think a lot of students, my observation is some will go hog wild with the freedom to the point where they're not coming to class. They have a lot of the uber rich students have Porsches, and they live in mansions. It's really amazing. But for most students, it's more like just an adjustment, and they observe. They're pretty astute. They observe how American students will ask questions, and they understand that their grades will be based on participation. So they learn pretty quickly how to adjust, and some don't. And that's, I think, the individual coaching that you need to do with certain students. Some will take to American system very easily, whereas others will just be so restricted and feeling so constrained by those cultural differences. It's really, in my opinion, one-to-one. You can't kind of, again, stereotype, but there are certain mindsets in the Chinese system that it takes a while to transition to the American system. And some never make that transition, and some make it quite nicely. Yeah.
I think one more other thing to remember is what you're telling your student is possibly very different from what they're learning at home, unfortunately. And so just trying to understand that they have pressures that you're not aware of. We're trying to understand what those pressures are, and I think that will contribute to understanding and how you can help them. I see a lot of Chinese kids studying things that they absolutely don't want to study, and unfortunately, that's a very sad state of affairs. So.
Yeah, please.
Up to 10% of
then
our
we'll go
student
over
body is comprised of students from China. And one of the challenges I face is that they're more result-oriented than they are process-oriented. As you mentioned, they have no problem with plagiarizing and things because they just get the answer. And so is this something that we're going to see continue, or is this a process of evolution? But I find it, again, very challenging.
I'm long view positive, as more of these exchanges, me sitting here talking to you, more of your Chinese kids in your classroom, they're learning from you and learning from all their fellow classmates. I mean, the world is shrinking very, very fast. Just look at the numbers and all the trends, and I think that we're all going to learn from each other.
No, we have to. Oh, over here somewhere. Oh, way over
Hi,
here.
sorry. I just have a question because I really appreciate the lecture, and it's a lot about like discipline, punishment, patriotism, and the contradictions in the Chinese education system. Yet I see a lot of those similarities in the United States system, so I'm curious if you can talk about that. Like, we're looking through the lens of America through the Chinese, and it seems shocking maybe to some of us, but I wonder if you can speak to, does China see the US as being as stark or contradictory in terms of like we're patriotic with the Pledge of Allegiance, or the censorship of history, we can't teach about certain things, or even the militarization of like gun violence and police being in schools, school shootings, ROTCs coming to schools? Like, do they see us the way that we see them as being a stark contrast? It's like we are just as contradictory and have a lot of patriotism in our schools as well?
Yes. One of, Darcy in my book, he basically says, you have a problem with guns. In China, we don't have guns, and it's because we have a one-party system. And he'll actually say the Democrats and Republicans, if they agreed on this issue, there would be no guns. I mean, they don't understand gun violence. They think it's so odd that we wouldn't get the guns, right? And that's where they look at their own systems and have a defense for it. Censorship is not as big a deal in China as you would think. People are very practical about the need for censorship. And frankly, there's still a third of China's living in poverty. We're still not getting equal access to education. When they look at censorship, they're like, that's a first world problem. All the Americans, and I come in there, I'm shocked too. I've had long conversations with the students I follow about this, and they say, you're missing the point. We have other things to worry about right now. So I don't know if that helps a little bit. One student comes to America and comes back and says, you guys have problems too, So absolutely, they see it too.
Yeah, we already have a couple memoirs, but there's going to be a flood of memoirs. The first from the 1980s were for people who came from China, spent a year or two, that sort of thing. But you started to see a memoir yesterday, right? Cecilia Hua talking about her experience in the United States and trying to represent that, right? And so we're going to get a flood of those. With regard to guns, I feel an obligation to say something there because I've had to call the parents of 4 USC students who died, 3 of them murdered. And the disconnect, there's nothing more horrible than working hard, pushing your child very hard to go to this promised land, to America to study, and to have their lives end there. And then in 3 of these cases, for it to have been a violent crime that ended their lives. It's hard for us to fathom, that kind of trauma and that kind of disconnect. I didn't mean that to end the conversation. We're close to our break time, but there's so much more that we can ask these folks about. Please.
All right, thanks. I guess just to clarify, like I know sometimes we make the comparison without explicitly say it. When you gave the presentation, Ms. Chu, you're really talking about mostly public schools in China versus the other presentation from Dr. Chong was more about public education. And I want us to just take a step back and think about that. I mean, in terms of like, this is Chinese government regulating education. And when we make that comparison, there's a lot of things that I feel is, that there's a lot of factors, right, that we really need to make clear, because sometimes it's so easy for us just to jump into conclusion and compare the two systems when ultimately they're very different. But I guess my question for you, Ms. Chu, is going back to your statistic, you were talking about how China looked at Taiwan test score and saying how like they spent half the time studying but got close to the score. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, why is that? What factors, if they look into it, that they can identify for that test scores?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Chinese are very concerned with the fact that most of education is driven by extrinsic motivation, by test scores, by praise from the teacher, by a parent telling you need to score 100 on this math test. And Western, Taiwan is more Westernized, right? They've had a longer history of being familiar with this idea of intrinsic motivation, and that a student should be interested in what they're learning about. And the Chinese understand they want to move in that direction. So that's partly where that comment comes from. When everyone's looking at just the gross rankings on math, reading, and science, the Chinese are actually looking at PISA looks at a lot of other things. Tons of other things, collaborative learning, critical thinking. In 2015, there was a focus on science. 2012, it was math and all kinds of things. And so they're looking at those things and trying to learn from other systems rather than those gross rankings that seem to grab all the headlines. So extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, and they're trying to move towards the intrinsic factors.
Question here.
I'm aware that there's a growth of experimental schools at all levels in China. So what's the impact of this experimental schools in that main Chinese education system?
It was on one of my slides. I didn't talk about it, but there's something like 11,000 private schools in China now, and it's growing very fast. Yeah, the proliferation of the private sector. I just think that it gives Chinese another option, and what options do is it's sort of like a market-driven reform, right? You can stamp all these policies from the top down, but if people are making choices on the ground, voting with their feet, then I think that will drive change, and I think I see that happening. And for wealthy Chinese too, they're also looking at international schools and schools abroad. They're opting out completely from the Gaokao system or the college entrance exam system, and that will drive change, just those choices. You know, China eventually, if they care, it's not clear, if they care, they will have to make changes to try to keep people in the system.
Yeah, if you're going to a school that's preparing students for the SAT as opposed to the Gaokao, that's an important signal.
My question is, Ms. Chu, you've mentioned about Chinese students learning in collective model. Could you say something about the positive and what the takeaway could be the collective learning model as you experienced in Shanghai and for Dr. Frank, could you like talk a little bit about that, the collective learning model? Will it be possible to apply to the U.S. education, or is there any chance of that?
We are already doing that.
Yeah.
I think we're already doing that in the U.S. system, you know, where we're even changing the furniture and the design of classrooms to better reflect collaboration rather than competition. So it's slow, but it's steady. As younger teachers come in, they're trained to work more collaboratively. They understand that's what industry wants. So we're trying to model and prepare students for the workplace, and that's the change from the old office space where you have a cubicle to an open space where everybody's sitting, you know, in a different, you know, collectively. So I think that's happening slowly but surely and incrementally in the classrooms of colleges that I have visited and high schools as well. So it's happening. Yeah, maybe not as quickly as you'd like to see, and maybe some schools are resistant to that, but that's just true in any system. You can have your early adopters, your middle, and then the people who are resistant. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
I think collectivist, I think that collectivism is going to always be a part of Chinese culture, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just that we have to be aware of that's how they, you know, I look at my son, he's been in the Chinese system now for 5 years, and he's now in American summer camp where the loudest kid is the one who gets noticed. He's not that kid, right? It's been sort of schooled out of him, and that's just the way it is. Americans look at a Steve Jobs, they look at innovation from a very individualistic perspective. It's the person who's loud, who comes out with brash and original ideas. But in China, I see innovation and creativity happening sort of through a different lens. And I think that there's this tendency to say the Chinese aren't creative. That's not necessarily true. They're not loud individually like we think creative geniuses should be. It's just a different way of looking at things. So.
And her son eats eggs.
Yes, he eats eggs now, so sometimes authoritarianism is good.
Okay, we're going to, after lunch, experiment with collaborative experiences in looking at the World Cafe and things like that. I just wanted to, first of all, ask you to join me in thanking these wonderful speakers.